Greetings and salutations. Today we will be covering the Room 1046 mystery. On January 2nd, 1935, a lone man carrying no luggage entered the Hotel President at 14th and Baltimore, 4 blocks from the Central Library. He had a face that made it hard to pin down his age. People gave accounts of his age being anywhere between his 20s and his 30s. Once having entered the hotel, the man would head straight for the front desk and ask for an interior room without a window, or facing the street, at least a few floors up. He would sign the register as Roland T. Owen, giving Los Angeles as his home address. Owen was noted to have cauliflower ear, which made it easy for them to denote the man as a professional wrestler or a boxer. He had dark brunette hair, which in part was used to cover a scar just above his ear. The desk clerk gave Mr. Owens the key to room 1046 and sent him off with bellboy Randolph Probst. Probst was sent with Owens to show him the way to his room, rather than help him with luggage, since even though he was noted as being rather neatly dressed, wearing a black overcoat, his only luggage was a black comb, a black hairbrush, and some toothpaste. As he was taken to his room, Owens started a conversation with Probst. Before reaching the 10th room, Owens would go on to mention that he had stayed at the Melbach Hotel. Chief amongst his complaints was the attempt by the hotel to charge $5 for his previous night's stay. They quickly exited the elevator once they reached the 10th floor, and made their way to room 1046. It was one of the ones within the inner row of rooms which looked down on the hotel's court, rather than the outer row which looked down on 14th Street. Having unlocked the door, Owens entered while Probst turned on the light for him. Having situated himself within the room, Owens took what little he had brought with him out of his overcoat, his hairbrush, a black comb, and the singular tube of toothpaste that he had brought with him. After this, the duo would head back downstairs to the lobby. An undefined amount of time would pass before a hotel maid by the name of Mary Soptic would return to work after her day off on the afternoon shift. She would go into room 1046 only to be met with surprise. Her surprise was due to Owens being there. This in part was due to her having expected the woman who had been there the previous night to have still been in the room. She would then apologize, but Owens would just tell her to continue her work cleaning the room. When she was done, she left, but Owens would ask her to leave the room unlocked, because he was expecting a friend to arrive in a few minutes. Later in her police interview, she would state that he was either worried about something or afraid, along with noting that he was always wanting to keep in the dark. She also stated that when she returned with towels later on, she found the guest sitting on his bed, with the shades down and lights off, fully dressed. There she noted that on his bedside table was a note that read, "Dawn, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." The next morning, Thursday, January 3rd, Soptic headed to room 1046 around 10:30 to clean it. Assuming that Owens was out, she unlocked the outside door lock with her pass keys. Something to note is that back then hotels normally had 2 sets of locks, one interior and one exterior. Once she entered the room, she noticed Owen was sitting on the bed, meaning that someone else had locked the door. In no short order, the phone rang, and Owen answered, saying, "No, Dawn, I don't want to eat. I'm not hungry. I just had breakfast." He would go on to repeat, "No, I am not hungry," with some force in his voice. Hanging up the phone, Owen proceeded to ask the maid about her job, asking things along the lines of if she had been charged with the entire floor, also asking if the Presidential was a residential hotel. He would go on to note that the hotel he had stayed at previously would try to get more out of him through a price for an inside room like the one he currently had, room 1046. After having gathered the soiled towers, Soptic would leave the room. Then, at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, clean towels had arrived from the laundry. She took the fresh towels to Owen's room. Nearing the room, she would hear 2 men talking, causing her to knock gently on the door, as to not interrupt. A rough voice then answered, "Who is it?" The maid told him that she was there with clean towels. The rough voice coarsely answered, "We don't need any," and she knew this was a lie, because there were no towels in the room. She had personally taken them out. 2 hours later, Gene Owens, a resident of Lee's Summit near Kansas City, checked into the Presidential, after having shopped in the city for a few hours. It should be noted that even though they shared the same last name. Roland T. Owens and Lee Owens were of no relation, regardless of the last name. The reason for her stay that night at the hotel was due to feeling sick and deciding not to drive back home that night. She was given room 1048, ironically leaving her close to the individual she shared a last name with. Her boyfriend, an individual who worked at a flower shop near the city, would come later that night to visit. He arrived at 9:20 p.m. He would stay for 2 hours. Her police statements, Lee would say that during the night she had heard a lot of noise which sounded as if it were on the same floor, and commented that it primarily consisted of men, stating that when the noise continued, I was about to call the desk, but I decided not to. Charles Blotcher was an elevator operator beginning his shift at midnight. Had reported that he was fairly busy until 1:30 a.m. However, he noted that there seemed to be a rowdy party at room 1055. He would later note during his police report that he took a woman he recognized as someone who frequented the hotel with different men in different rooms. He would go on to say, it was my impression from this woman's actions that she was a commercial woman. I took her to the 10th floor, upon which she made inquiries about room 1026. About 5 minutes later, I received a signal to come back to the 10th floor. Upon arriving, I met this same woman, and she wondered why he wasn't in his room, noting that he had called her and had always been very prompt in his appointments, and she wondered if he might be in room 1024 because the light was on there, and once I had taken her to the destination, she remained there for 30 or 40 minutes. Then I received the signal to go back up to the 10th floor. I went back, and this same woman appeared there and came down the elevator with me and left the lobby in its entirety. About an hour later, she returned with the company of a man. I took them to the 9th floor. Later, I received the signal to go to the 9th floor at 4:15 a.m. and that same woman came down from the 9th floor and left the hotel. In a period of about 15 minutes, the man came down the elevator from the 9th floor as well. He was complaining that he couldn't sleep, so he was going out for a while. Blotcher would describe the man as wearing a light brown overcoat and a brown hat with brown shoes. The woman was described as having black hair, wearing a coat of black Hudson or imitation Hudson seal. The coat had a collar which was a light fur strip, and the collar was stood up. However, if these activities were related to Owens were not answered. He may not even have been in the hotel earlier that night. The next known encounter between Owen and hotel staff was at 7 a.m. A new switchboard operator, Delia Ferguson, just started her shift. She was beginning to make wake-up calls to room 1046 and saw the light indicating that the phone had been off the hook, so she dispatched a bellboy, Randolph Prospetto, in order to alert whomever had made the wake-up request. The bellboy knocked on the door. There was a do not disturb sign on the door. The bellboy would knock loudly and get no response. After a moment, he knocked again, even louder so, and finally got a response from a deep voice telling him to come in. Turning the doorknob, he noticed it was locked. Seeing it was still locked, he knocked again and made the request to be allowed in. However, this time he heard the deep voice tell him to turn on the lights. He would continue knocking. After 7 or 8 more attempts, his patience would wear thin, and he yelled through the door, "Put the phone back on the hook." Getting no response, the bellboy returned to the lobby, where he would tell the switchboard operator that the guy in the room was probably drunk, and that she should try again in an hour or so. At 8:30 a.m., she saw that the phone had still not been hung up. She would then send Harold Pike up to ask Owen to hang up the phone. When Pike got up there, he found that the door was still locked, and he used his passkey to let himself in. Again, this shows that it had not been locked by Owens from the inside, but by someone from the outside. Thanks to the light from the hallway, Pike noted that Owen was lying on bed, naked, surrounded by what appeared to be dark shadows. Believing he was drunk, he also noted the telephone stand had been knocked over. Seeing the phone was on the floor, Pike straightened the stand and put the phone on it. Being certain to hang up the phone, he then locked the door behind him and went back to the lobby, telling his supervisor that Owen was lying naked in bed and seemingly drunk. Sometime between 10:30 and 10:45 a.m., another operator reported to Betty Cole that they saw that the phone from 1046 was once more off the hook. At around 11 o'clock, Randolph Prost headed back to the room where he noted that the do not disturb sign was still on. After knocking loudly 3 times, he took his key and unlocked the room, entering the room, and he found Otegri on his knees. Prost turned the light on, placed the phone back on its hook, and he noticed blood in both the main room and the bathroom, as well as on the bed itself. In his police interview, he would state that he looked around and saw blood on the walls, on the bed, on the bathroom. This frightened him, and he immediately left the room and went downstairs. Props rushed to get the assistant manager, M.S. Weaver, to inform him of the situation he had walked into, and told him what he found. The assistant manager called the police. Then he headed for room 1046, but he could only open the door about 6 inches. Apparently, Owen had collapsed on the door on the other side, pushing it forward. Some other accounts place Owens in the bathtub at this time. Shortly after the call, the police would arrive. Detective William Eldridge, Ira Johnson, along with Detective Sergeant Frank Howland and Dr. Harold F. Flanders, who would arrive from the General Hospital. And lastly, they would be joined by Detective D.C. King. It appeared as if Owens had been restrained with a cord around his neck and his wrists. Also, his ankles appeared to have been tortured. A myriad of knife wounds marked his chest, mainly having some coming from above his heart. One of these had punctured a lung. The right side of his skull also was fractured, and it was clear that he had been struck more than once. There was bruising around his neck, pointing to some sort of strangulation. Besides the blood that was on the bed, there was blood on the wall, and some had even made it onto the ceiling. In all sense of the word, it was a bloodbath. Upon his arrival, Dr. Flanders had cut the cords around Owen's wrists. Now freed from his restraints, Owen attempted to turn on the bathtub spigot, which Flanders shut off. He then asked if anyone had done this to him. Owen answered nobody. After this, he was asked what had caused these injuries. He replied that he had fallen and hit his head on the bathtub. This time, however, they asked if he had been trying to kill himself. After saying no, Owens lost consciousness and was rushed to the hospital. Later, Flanders would note that the majority of the wounds inflicted on Owens had been clocked down to between 6 and 7 hours prior to them finding him. This was partly because the dried blood around him had become a dried and hard mass. The blood on the furniture had also solidified. While searching the room, detectives found it more useful to note what was not in the room rather than what was. They noted that the room was bereft of any clothing. The closest thing to clothing in the room was a tag from a necktie. Also missing were things like the hotel amenities such as towels, soaps, and these types of items. The authorities were also unable to find any knife of any sort or any other weapon that might have been responsible for the stabbing injuries that the victim received, all but eliminating the possibility of suicide. Besides the tie tag, the only items found in the room were a hairpin, a bottle of sulfuric acid. There were also 2 water glasses left in the room, one on the shelf above the sink and another glass inside the sink. This one was broken. The glass on top of the telephone stand had 4 small fingerprints, and the deduction of what type of fingerprints they were due to the size being more similar to that of a woman's hands. The Kansas City Star, along with the Kansas City Journal-Post, both had the story as a front news page that day. The Journal-Post had the quote from one of the detectives saying, "There's no doubt that someone else is mixed up in this incident." Incidentally, Miss Owens was held for questioning, but she was let go once she was able to show an alibi with her boyfriend, Joe Reinert. By the time he had reached the hospital, Roland Owen was completely comatose, and he was dead shortly thereafter at midnight on January 5th. The detectives in charge of the case contacted the Los Angeles Police Department that night, and they found no record of any Roland T. Owens residing in the city. Before the night had passed, the police had sent word to send Owens' fingerprints to the Justice Department's Bureau of Investigation. Soon the police settled on the idea that Roland T. Owen was likely an alias, and that now they would need to find out who he was. A woman called the hotel president that night to ask what Roland T. Owens looked like. She told the desk that he lived in Clinton, 50 miles southeast of Kansas City. On January 6th, the Sunday newspapers reported that the man in room 1046 had died under an assumed name, no longer reporting his identity as Roland T. Owen, but rather John Doe. This caused tips to begin flooding in. Members of the public streamed the local funeral home where Owens had been held and laid out, leading to Robert Lane telling the police about the encounter he had with this man. Once interviewed, he would go on to say that he was Robert Lane and he met the man at 11 p.m. while driving on 13th Street near Lydia Avenue. He spotted a man dressed wearing only an undershirt, pants, shoes, and nothing else, who ran into his path and flagged him down. Once he stopped, the man apologized, telling Lane that he had made a mistake believing his car was a taxi. The man proceeded to ask Lane if he could take him somewhere so he could get a taxi. Lane, seeing nothing strange with the man, agreed to help him, telling him, "You look as if you've been in it bad." He remembered the man swore he would kill someone else tomorrow, presumably in retaliation for what had been done to him. In the mirror, Lane saw a rather deep scratch going down the man's arm. He also noted that he was holding his arm closed, believed it was done to prevent blood from leaving the man's wound. He would go on to leave the man between the intersection of 12th Street and Trutz Avenue. After the interview with Lane, it was decided that the individual he had met was not their John Doe. This was because none of the hotel staff had seen him leave or return on the night of January 3rd or 4th. However, the police were able to establish one sighting of the victim outside the hotel from the aforementioned report stating that two women at several liquor places on 12th Street had seen him, which really left more questions than answers. The story had been picked up by multiple publications as time went by, leading to more people to contact the Kansas City police to see if the victim might be a relative or someone in their lives who they had lost or gone missing. Most of these would be discounted due to either not including descriptions or having descriptions that do not match their John Doe. One of the only things the police were able to establish is that Owen had been seen in certain liquor places on 12th Street in the company of two women. But other than that, they didn't have much to go on until they started to hear back from police departments from around the country. This allowed them to lead more narrow searches, eliminating significant numbers of theories. After many dead ends, detectives decided to look into statements about Owen having stayed at the Melbuck Hotel the night before he came to the president. As it turned out, no Roland T. Owens was at the Melbuck. However, there was an individual who matched Owen's description who went by the name of Eugene K. Scott. The police contacted the LAPD and asked information about this individual since he also stated that Los Angeles was his place of residence. However, the police department once again found no records of any individual under that name residing in Los Angeles. The detectives would now turn to finding information about the other individual who was known as Don. This individual was assumed to be the individual who was in the company of Owen/Scott, along with whoever the unnamed woman who had happened to be there Thursday night through Friday morning. Questions if they were a couple came about, however they were not answered. It was assumed that the rough voice the maid heard through the door was Don. However, this line of investigation led the cops nowhere. Others would come to identify the body, including one Ernest Johnson of Kansas City. He would view the body and believe it to be his cousin. However, his family would tell him otherwise. His cousin had died years ago. On Friday, January 12th, Tony Bernardi would identify the body as that of one of the individuals who had asked him to promote him as a wrestler. He went by the name of Cecil Warner. On March 3rd, the funeral home that had been keeping the body announced that they would be burying him in Potter's Field the next day. That day, the funeral home received a call from a man that asked that the funeral be delayed so that a funeral money could be sent so that a grave and service could be held at Memorial Park Cemetery in Kansas City, Kansas. The caller said that the dead man would be near his sister. The funeral director warned the caller that the police would be told about the call. The caller replied that he knew and he wasn't bothered. The caller was slightly forthcoming when the funeral director asked why Owens had been killed. It is rumored that the statement "cheaters usually get what they've got coming to them" was said by the caller, who would then hang up. At the anonymous caller's request, the service was held up. On March 23rd, the funeral home received a delivery of an envelope. The address had been meticulously written, containing $25 wrapped in a newspaper. This would be enough for the funeral. 2 additional envelopes were sent to a florist in order to get 13 American Beauty roses to go along with the grave. After a similar call was made to them, both phone calls turned out to have been made from payphones. The payment was included with the card, and the card had the handwriting "Love Forever, Louise." The funeral was only attended by police and the officiating minister. The police would continue to stake out the area days afterwards. Images of the dead man were continuously circulated nationwide in hopes of identifying him. Eventually, one of these succeeded, and Ruby Ogletree from Birmingham, Alabama, identified him when shown an issue of American Weekly. Ruby would contact the KCPD and tell them that it was her son, Artemis, who the family had not seen since he left to hitchhike to California in 1934. However, they did note that he had kept in contact through written letters, and she was able to provide enough information, including the origin of the scar being a grease burn that happened in early childhood. Thanks to Ruby, the police were able to positively identify this individual as Artemis Ogletree. While this answered some questions, it raised others. Ruby's account claimed that she had received letters from her son after he had been killed. The first letter in early 1935 was postmarked from Chicago. It aroused suspicions since it was typewritten, and as far as she knew, her son Artemis did not know how to use a typewriter. It was also written in a highly colloquial style that was not consistent with the previous letters that he had handwritten. In May 1935, another letter purportedly from Artemis said that he was going to Europe. It was followed by a special delivery letter saying that the ship was sailing by that day. Both were sent from New York. In August, Ruby received a telephone call from Memphis, Tennessee. A man calling her told her that Artemis had saved his life in a fight and that Artemis himself could not be there or call because he was in Cairo, Egypt, and he was married to a wealthy woman and was doing well over there. And apparently he wasn't able to write because he had lost his thumb. Ruby would talk to this man for about an hour, who spoke wildly and apparently had a lot of first-hand knowledge about Artemis. The American consulate showed that Artemis had never been to Egypt, so if he had ever been, it had been under a false name. In 1937, New York City police arrested a man named Joseph Martin on a murder charge. He had killed a man who he had shared a room with and put the body in a trunk and shipped it to Memphis. Among several aliases found was Donald Kelso. According to a story about the case in the New Yorker, the KCPD had matched samples of his handwriting to that in letters written to Ruby Ogletree. However, in reality, the handwriting did not match, at least not according to the FBI, which reviewed the case in 1950. It was concluded that the signature of Donald Kelso on the hotel registration was not written by Joseph Ogden. An FBI informant told reporters. Their prime suspect, now cleared by the FBI, left the murder unanswered. Kansas City cops seemed to have stopped working on it. Occasionally, cops would pick up the information and start researching it, only to put it back, leaving a note saying that they will attempt again later. However, for all intents and purposes, this is a cold case that will remain cold. Now, there are some theories surrounding the case. One, based on some of the letters that were sent to Ruby, had her believing it was Joe Simpson, the boy her son had left home with. She even went as far as to obtain school records from Phillips High School to match the writing. She spent years trying to meet up with him in Birmingham. Cops would politely tell her that they had already investigated the individual and essentially cleared him. However, she refused to believe this and would continue to try to meet with him, eventually getting a break, successfully confronting him and having a chat with him. In this conversation, he would offhandedly mention that Kansas City can boast of being the home of the perfect crime. He laughed and said, "It is, and that they'll never find the ones who killed him." Simpson promised to pass Ruby another letter from Artemis Ogletree, which he claimed had been badly typed, but he never would meet back up with her, leading her to believe for the rest of her life that it was him who killed her son. However, other theories are abound, including, but not limited to, Don being shorthand for Don as in a mob Don, and him having been in a relationship with a woman who he cheated with and ended up killing him, to even to his death being a supernatural incident. If you have remained with me until the end, I thank you, and I do hope you stay tuned for more content.